Ambassador Zethkar's 4 eyes blinked in rapid succession as she read the message for the 7th time. The crystalline datapad trembled in her scaled hands, its blue light casting eerie shadows across her reptilian features. Around her, the grand chamber of the Galactic Council buzzed with confusion and barely contained panic. "They cannot be serious," muttered Councillor Vex's thigh from the floating platform designated for the ethereal collective. His gaseous form shimmered with agitation, the usual calm blue of his energy field now flickering between orange and red. "Humans do not simply withdraw from negotiations of this magnitude." The message was brief, almost insultingly so given the circumstances. Ambassador Sarah Chen's words burned in Zethkar's mind. "The United Earth Coalition formally withdraws from the Kepler Accord peace negotiations, effective immediately. We wish all parties the best in their future endeavors." No explanation, no demands, no threats. Just a polite farewell that had thrown the most important peace summit in galactic history into complete chaos. The Kepler Accord was supposed to end the devastating three-way war between the Hegemony Alliance, the Stellar Federation, and the Void Consortium. For 18 months, these three massive galactic powers had been locked in brutal combat that had already consumed 12 star systems and billions of lives. The war had started over mining rights to the rare element quintessium in the Outer Rim territories, but had quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. What most beings didn't understand was that humanity had never been intended as a major player in these negotiations. When the Galactic Council had first contacted Earth 2 decades ago, humans were classified as a developing species, technologically advanced enough to be useful, but not quite ready for full membership in galactic society. They had been invited to the Kepler negotiations as observers, with a minor voice in discussions that didn't directly involve their small corner of the galaxy. That assessment had been a catastrophic miscalculation. Zethkar remembered the first time she had met Ambassador Chen. The human woman was unremarkable by galactic standards. No impressive height like the Goliath clan. No natural armor like the Chitin Collective. No mental powers like the Sion Empire. She was just a middle-aged woman with graying hair and laugh lines around her dark eyes. Zethkar had initially dismissed her as another primitive representative from a species that would probably extinct themselves within a few centuries. The first shock had come during the initial trade discussions. The major powers had been arguing for weeks about resource allocation and shipping routes, when Chen had quietly suggested a solution that would benefit everyone. Her proposal was so elegantly simple that Zethkar wondered why none of them had thought of it. Within hours, they had their first breakthrough. Then came the prisoner exchange negotiations. The three warring factions had been holding each other's civilians hostage, and attempts to arrange swaps had repeatedly failed due to mistrust and accusations of favoritism. Chen had proposed a neutral monitoring system using automated drones and blockchain verification, technologies that were common on Earth but had somehow never been applied to this type of diplomacy. The exchange had proceeded flawlessly. One by one, the seemingly impossible knots of the peace process had been quietly untangled by human suggestions, not through superior technology or military might, but through what Chen called lateral thinking and common sense, concepts that apparently didn't translate well into most galactic languages. The humans had a disturbing tendency to find solutions where others saw only problems. When the Hegemony and Federation couldn't agree on territorial boundaries, Chen had suggested they jointly develop the disputed regions and share the profits. When the Void Consortium demanded reparations that would bankrupt their enemies, the humans proposed a graduated payment system tied to economic recovery. When cultural differences threatened to derail talks entirely, human mediators found compromises that preserved everyone's dignity. Most unsettling of all was how they approached warfare itself. Every other species in the galaxy understood conflict as a natural state of existence. You fought until you won, lost, or could fight no more. Humans seemed to view war as a problem to be solved, rather than a contest to be won. They would spend hours analyzing the root causes of conflicts, suggesting economic partnerships where others saw only military targets, proposing cultural exchanges where others demanded submission. It was disturbing. It was unnatural. And it was working. The three-way war that had seemed destined to drag on for decades was actually approaching a resolution. Trade agreements were being drafted. Territorial disputes were being settled through compromise rather than conquest. Reparation payments were being structured in ways that would help rebuild rather than punish. After 18 months of negotiations, the Kepler Accord was perhaps 2 weeks away from being signed, and now the humans were gone. Zethkar looked around the emergency session that had been called within hours of receiving Earth's withdrawal notice. Representatives from 57 species filled the council chamber. But the 3 most important delegations sat in stony silence. Fleet Commander Gaxatul of the Hegemony Alliance was methodically sharpening his ceremonial battle claws, a habit that usually preceded a declaration of war. Ambassador Silthara of the Stellar Federation was reviewing military deployment reports on her data slate, her usual diplomatic smile replaced by the cold expression of a predator evaluating prey. And worst of all, the Void Consortium delegation had simply walked out of the chamber entirely, their final words being, "We will resume this discussion when there are serious parties present." Without human mediation, the fragile peace framework was collapsing in real time. "Perhaps we misunderstood their message," suggested Counselor Plex of the Harmonious Collective, his melodic voice carrying a note of desperation. "Surely they intend to return after addressing some internal matter?" Zethkar accessed her private communications array and displayed the message trail for the assembled council. "I have attempted to contact Ambassador Chen 14 times in the past 6 hours. All messages are answered with the same automated response. The United Earth Coalition is no longer participating in Kepler Accord negotiations. Please direct all future communications through standard diplomatic channels." Standard diplomatic channels? Fleet Commander Gaxatul's voice was a threatening growl. What does that even mean? Are they suggesting we go through the Galactic Commerce Registry for peace negotiations? The question hung in the air because none of them actually knew. Human diplomatic protocols were notoriously informal compared to the elaborate hierarchies and ceremonies used by most galactic civilizations. Other species had departments of diplomacy with centuries-old traditions and carefully defined procedures. Humans seemed to just send whoever was available and figured out the details as they went along. What made it worse was that it worked. Human ambassadors consistently achieved better outcomes than their more experienced counterparts. Not through superior preparation or formal training, but through what they called building relationships and understanding people. These concepts were almost impossible to quantify or replicate. Counselor Vextai's energy field pulsed with frustrated confusion. What could possibly have motivated this withdrawal? Our intelligence suggests that Earth gained significant benefits from the peace accord. Expanded trade routes, technology transfers, security guarantees. Why would they abandon all of that? This question had been driving Zethkar to distraction since the withdrawal notice arrived. From a purely logical standpoint, human participation in galactic civilization offered their species enormous advantages. Access to faster-than-light travel technology, exotic matter manipulation, psionic enhancement techniques, medical advances that could extend human lifespans by centuries. All of this was on the table, as part of humanity's integration into galactic society. But humans had always been difficult to understand from a purely logical standpoint. Zethkar had spent months studying human psychology and culture in preparation for these negotiations. What she had discovered was deeply unsettling. Most galactic species were driven by clear, quantifiable motivations: resource acquisition, territorial expansion, technological advancement, genetic optimization. Humans were motivated by abstract concepts that often contradicted their immediate self-interest. They would sacrifice economic advantages for something they called principles. They would choose more difficult paths if they believed those paths were more fair to others. They would abandon beneficial relationships if they felt those relationships compromised their integrity. Most bizarre of all, they seemed to value being respected more than being feared, being trusted more than being obeyed. The more Zethkar learned about humanity, the more she suspected that their withdrawal from the peace talks wasn't actually about the humans at all. It was about everyone else. During the negotiations, she had watched human representatives become increasingly uncomfortable with certain aspects of the process. They had objected to proposed territorial divisions that would displace civilian populations. They had pushed back against reparation demands that would cause economic hardship for non-combatant worlds. They had repeatedly insisted on protective clauses for neutral systems and trade routes. At the time, these objections had seemed like typical human sentimentality. Their inexplicable concern for beings they had never met and would never encounter. Other species had learned to work around these quirks by framing proposals in terms of humanitarian benefits or long-term stability. The humans would accept almost any compromise if it could be presented as protecting innocent bystanders. But looking back now, Zethkar realized that human objections had become more frequent and more intense in recent weeks. Ambassador Chen had started asking pointed questions about enforcement mechanisms and accountability measures. Human legal advisors had been requesting detailed information about civilian protection protocols and war crimes tribunals. It was possible that humanity had withdrawn not because the peace process was failing, but because it was succeeding in ways they found morally unacceptable. This possibility was far more terrifying than any of the alternatives. If humans had simply gotten bored or distracted, they might eventually be convinced to return. If they had been offered a better deal by some outside party, counteroffers could be negotiated. If they were trying to gain leverage for additional concessions, compromises could be arranged. But if they had withdrawn because they genuinely disapproved of the peace accord itself, if they had decided that this carefully crafted agreement was somehow wrong or harmful, then there might be no bringing them back. And without them, Zethkar was increasingly convinced that there would be no peace at all. The human talent for finding solutions wasn't just helpful. It had become absolutely essential. The current negotiations had been structured around human-proposed frameworks and human-mediated compromises. Remove those elements, and the entire process collapsed into the same impossible deadlocks that had characterized the first attempts at peace. Already, she could see the old patterns reasserting themselves. The hegemony was reverting to demands for total surrender. The Federation was insisting on punitive reparations. The consortium was threatening to resume offensive operations if their territorial claims weren't immediately recognized. Without human voices calling for moderation, restraint, and mutual understanding, the peace talks were transforming back into preliminary negotiations for the next war. Fleet Commander Gaxatul stood slowly, his massive form casting a shadow across half the chamber. If the humans wish to absent themselves from galactic affairs, that is their choice. We will proceed without them. But even as he spoke the words, Zethkar could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Everyone in the chamber knew that proceeding without the humans meant proceeding without any realistic hope of success. The question that nobody wanted to ask was simple. What had they done to make humanity walk away? And the question that nobody wanted to answer was even simpler. How could they get them back before it was too late? The emergency session had been running for 18 hours when the first shots were fired. Ambassador Zethkar was reviewing casualty projections with her senior staff when the alert klaxons began wailing throughout the council station. The holographic display in front of her immediately shifted from diplomatic charts to tactical readouts, showing weapon signatures across 3 star systems. Confirmed engagement between Hegemony and Federation fleets in the Altair sector, reported her intelligence aide, his scales pale with stress. Multiple ships down on both sides. The Void Consortium is mobilizing their reserve forces. The war had resumed barely 48 hours after humanity's withdrawal from the peace talks. Zethkar collapsed into her chair as the horrible predictability of it all crashed down on her. Without human mediation, the fragile ceasefire agreements had lasted exactly as long as it took the various fleets to return to their previous positions. Now, after 18 months of painstaking negotiations, they were right back where they started, except this time with better weapons, deeper grudges, and absolutely no hope of a peaceful resolution. The door to her office chimed, and Councillor Vextai materialized through the wall in his typical dramatic fashion. His energy field was a deep red, indicating extreme agitation. "Have you managed to establish contact with Earth?" he asked, without preamble. "Nothing," Zethkar replied wearily. "Every communication attempt is met with the same automated response. It's as if they've simply disappeared from galactic politics entirely. That cannot be allowed to continue." Vextai's form pulsed with determination. "The Harmonious Collective is prepared to dispatch a diplomatic mission directly to Earth. We must convince them to return." Zethkar had been considering the same option, but something about it felt wrong. Humans were notoriously independent, and their withdrawal notice had been remarkably final. Pursuing them might actually make the situation worse. What if they refuse to see us? She asked. What if they've made this decision permanent? Then we need to understand why they made it in the first place. The answer to that question had been consuming Zethkar's thoughts for days. She had reviewed every recorded session of the peace talks, analyzed every human proposal and objection, studied every transcript of private conversations that had been diplomatically shared between delegations. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. Humanity's discomfort with the peace process hadn't been random or emotional. It had been systematic and increasingly urgent. They had raised concerns about enforcement mechanisms that could be used to oppress neutral systems. They had questioned territorial agreements that would force civilian relocations. They had objected to resource allocation plans that would create permanent economic dependencies. Most tellingly, they had repeatedly asked about long-term consequences and accountability measures, questions that other species had dismissed as unnecessarily complicated. Now, as the galaxy slipped back into war, those questions seemed prophetic rather than naive. The communication array in her office suddenly activated, displaying the urgent face of Admiral Crixneth from the Galactic Security Council. Ambassador, we have a situation developing that requires immediate attention. Are you familiar with the human concept of humanitarian intervention? Zethkar felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Somewhat. Why do you ask? Because we're detecting massive human fleet movements along the borders of the conflict zones, not towards any military targets, but towards civilian populations in contested systems. The tactical display shifted to show the real-time positions of known human vessels. Zethkar stared in amazement as dozens of ships, far more than anyone had realized humanity possessed, moved in precise formations towards planets that were likely to become battlegrounds in the renewed war. What are they doing? Whispered Vexthai. Admiral Crixneth's expression was grim. Based on their movement patterns and public communications, it appears they're conducting large-scale evacuation operations. They're removing civilian populations from systems that are about to become war zones. The implications hit Zethkar like a physical blow. Humanity hadn't withdrawn from galactic politics at all. They had withdrawn from the peace talks because they knew those talks were going to fail, and they had immediately begun preparing for the consequences of that failure. While the major powers had spent 2 days arguing about whose fault it was that the negotiations had collapsed, humanity had been quietly positioning themselves to save the innocent beings who would suffer when the fighting resumed. It was brilliant, it was infuriating, and it was absolutely typical human behavior. How many ships are involved in these operations? Zethkar asked. At least 60 confirmed vessels, possibly more. They seem to be operating some kind of coordinated fleet that we weren't aware existed. Intelligence suggests they've been building this capability for months, possibly since the peace talks began. Vexthai's energy field flickered with confused admiration. They were planning for the failure of negotiations while actively participating in those same negotiations? It appears so. And there's something else. Admiral Crixneth hesitated before continuing. Several of the systems they're targeting for evacuations aren't currently under threat. These are planets and stations that wouldn't become conflict zones unless the war escalated significantly beyond its current scope. The meaning was clear and terrifying. Humanity wasn't just preparing for the war to resume. They were preparing for it to get much worse than it had been before. Somehow, they had predicted not only the failure of the peace process but the likely trajectory of the renewed conflict. Zethkar accessed her personal files and pulled up the human demographic and industrial reports that had been shared during the negotiations. She had assumed the information was complete, but now she realized it might have been significantly understated. Admiral, what's our current assessment of human military capabilities? That's complicated. Their official military consists of approximately 200 vessels distributed across 15 systems. But these evacuation operations suggest access to resources and logistics capabilities that are far beyond what those numbers would indicate. Could they have been concealing the true size of their forces? Possible, but unlikely. Our surveillance of human space has been quite thorough. More probably, They've been developing alternative capabilities that don't fit our standard military classifications. Zethkar thought about the human approach to problem-solving during the negotiations. They never seemed to use the most obvious solution to any challenge. Instead, they would find unexpected angles and creative alternatives that achieved the same goals through entirely different methods. If humanity had been developing military capabilities, they probably wouldn't look like traditional fleets at all. What kind of alternative capabilities? She asked. Converted civilian vessels with unusual modifications. Automated systems that can operate without crew. Distributed networks of small units, rather than concentrated battle groups. Resource allocation that prioritizes sustainability and flexibility over raw firepower. It was exactly what she should have expected. Other species built militaries to win wars. Humans apparently built militaries to end them. The communication array activated again, this time displaying the concerned face of Trade Representative Zelnara from the Neutral Commerce Guild. Ambassador, I need to brief you on some economic developments that are unprecedented. Zethkar was beginning to hate that word. What kind of developments? Human trading vessels have begun establishing temporary commercial hubs in neutral systems throughout the galaxy. They're offering extremely favorable rates for essential supplies, medical equipment, food production technology, communication systems, even basic industrial machinery. That doesn't sound unprecedented, Vexthai commented. Increased trade during wartime is perfectly normal. Though, that is not part of Li Ri's. The unprecedented part, Zelnara continued, is that they're selling these supplies at prices that are below their production costs, in some cases, significantly below. They're also establishing these hubs in systems that aren't strategically valuable for traditional commerce. Zethkar felt the pieces of a larger picture beginning to come together. They're preparing neutral systems to handle refugee populations. More than that, they're building infrastructure that would allow those systems to support massive population increases while maintaining economic independence. It's as if they're creating an entirely separate economy designed specifically for displaced civilians. The scope of human preparation was staggering. While the major powers had been focused on negotiating the terms of peace, humanity had been quietly building the infrastructure to manage the consequences of war. They had anticipated not just the failure of the talks, but the specific ways that failure would impact innocent populations throughout the galaxy, and they had been planning their response for months. Admiral Crixnith appeared again on the communication array, his expression even more serious than before. Ambassador, we have another development. The human evacuation fleets are being escorted by unidentified vessels using technology we don't recognize. The tactical display updated to show detailed scans of the mysterious escort ships. They were smaller than traditional military vessels, but appeared to be heavily shielded and extremely fast. Most unusually, they seemed to be operating in perfect coordination despite being distributed across dozens of star systems. Could they be allies we're not aware of? Vexthai asked. Negative. The energy signatures don't match any known species. But they're definitely artificial constructs, not biological vessels. Zethkar studied the scan data with growing amazement. They're automated systems. Humanity has built an automated escort fleet to protect their civilian operations. It was another example of the human tendency to find unexpected solutions to military challenges. Instead of building a traditional navy to fight other fleets, they had built a specialized force designed specifically to protect non-combatants in war zones. The automated escort vessels weren't optimized for ship-to-ship combat. They were optimized for getting civilian transports safely through dangerous areas. How effective are these escort systems? She asked. Unknown. But preliminary analysis suggests they're specifically designed to counter the weapons and tactics used by the three major powers. It's possible that humanity has been studying our military capabilities in detail and developing countermeasures. The implications were staggering. Humanity hadn't just withdrawn from the peace talks because they disapproved of the proposed terms. They had withdrawn because they had their own plan for managing the galactic conflict. A plan that apparently involved protecting civilian populations, while the major powers fought each other to exhaustion. Zethkar realized that she had been thinking about the situation entirely wrong. She had assumed that humanity's withdrawal was a problem to be solved, that getting them back to the negotiating table was essential for achieving peace. But what if humanity had decided that the negotiating table was the problem? What if they had concluded that the major powers were fundamentally incapable of creating lasting peace, and had instead chosen to focus on minimizing the damage when those powers inevitably returned to war? It was a profoundly cynical assessment of galactic civilization. It was also, Zethkar was forced to admit, probably accurate. The communication array activated once more, this time showing Ambassador Chen herself. The human woman looked tired but determined, and she was clearly calling from the bridge of a spaceship rather than a diplomatic facility. "Ambassador Zethkar," Chen said without preamble, "I understand you've been trying to contact us." "Ambassador Chen," Zethkar tried to keep her relief from showing. "We've been hoping to discuss your withdrawal from the negotiations. The situation has become quite serious." "Yes, I can see that. 37 civilian casualties in the first day of renewed fighting, with projections suggesting it will get much worse." The specific casualty numbers surprised Zethkar. Human intelligence capabilities were apparently much better than anyone had realized. "That's exactly why we need to restart the peace talks," Zethkar continued. "Without human mediation, we're seeing the same deadlocks that prevented progress before." "I know." Chen's expression was sympathetic but firm. "That's precisely why we won't be returning to the talks." "I don't understand." "Ambassador, we spent 18 months trying to help your people create a peace agreement that would actually prevent future conflicts. Every proposal we made was designed to address the underlying causes of instability in this region of the galaxy. And every single one of those proposals was systematically weakened or eliminated during negotiations." Chen paused, her expression growing more serious. "The Kepler Accord, as it was developing in the final weeks, wouldn't have created peace. It would have created a temporary ceasefire that would inevitably collapse within a few years, probably in a way that would make the next war even worse than this one." Zethkar wanted to argue, but the renewed fighting that had erupted so quickly after humanity's withdrawal seemed to prove Chen's point. "So you've decided to abandon galactic diplomacy entirely?" "We've decided to focus our efforts on protecting the people who will suffer, while the rest of you figure out how to stop killing each other." Chen's bluntness was startling, but Zethkar found it oddly refreshing after days of diplomatic doublespeak. "The evacuation operations," Zethkar said, "are just the beginning. We're building infrastructure to support displaced populations, establishing trade networks that aren't dependent on the major powers, and developing defense systems that can protect neutral territories without contributing to the broader conflict. You're creating an alternative to galactic civilization. We're creating a safety net for the people that galactic civilization keeps failing." The communication ended abruptly, leaving Zethkar staring at the blank screen with a mixture of admiration and horror. Humanity hadn't withdrawn from galactic politics because they were naive or idealistic. They had withdrawn because they were realistic enough to recognize that the current system was fundamentally broken, and pragmatic enough to start building something better. The question now was whether the rest of the galaxy would learn from their example, or simply continue fighting until there was nothing left worth saving. 6 months after humanity's withdrawal from the Kepler Accord negotiations, Ambassador Zethkar found herself standing in the ruins of what had once been the Nexus Prime trading station. The massive structure, which had served as a neutral meeting point for dozens of species, was now a twisted wreck drifting through space. Like so many civilian installations, it had been caught in the crossfire when the three-way war escalated beyond anyone's expectations. But Zethkar wasn't here to survey the damage. She was here because, impossibly, the station was showing signs of life. "Reconstruction progress is approximately 60% complete," reported her engineering aide as their shuttle approached the docking bay. "Power systems are online, atmosphere is stable in most sections, and we're detecting civilian life signs throughout the structure." "How is that possible?" Zethkar asked. "The station was completely destroyed 4 months ago. According to our records, a human reconstruction fleet arrived here approximately 6 weeks after the attack. They've been working continuously since then to restore functionality." As their shuttle entered the docking bay, Zethkar could see the evidence of human engineering everywhere. The rebuilt sections of the station didn't look quite like the original. They were more modular, more flexible, and somehow more organic in their design. But they were also clearly more robust than what had been there before. Waiting for them at the airlock was a familiar figure. Ambassador Chen, now apparently serving as some kind of civilian administrator rather than a diplomatic representative. Ambassador Zethkar, Chen said with a genuine smile. Welcome to New Nexus Station. I wasn't sure you'd accept our invitation. Your message was intriguing, Zethkar replied carefully. Though I admit, I wasn't sure what to expect. Come on, I'll show you around. There's a lot to see. As they walked through the station's corridors, Zethkar was amazed by what humanity had accomplished in such a short time. The original Nexus Prime had been a purely commercial facility, efficient but sterile, designed solely for trade and transportation. New Nexus Station was something entirely different. There were schools where refugee children from a dozen species learned together. Medical facilities that provided free care, regardless of a patient's ability to pay. Community gardens where different species shared agricultural techniques. Cultural centers where beings who had been enemies just months ago were now collaborating on artistic projects. How many people are living here now? Zethkar asked. About 40,000 permanent residents, plus another 20,000 who rotate through regularly. Most are refugees from the war zones. But we also have researchers, artists, teachers, and plenty of beings who just wanted to live somewhere that wasn't constantly preparing for the next conflict. They paused at an observation deck that offered a view of the surrounding space. Zethkar counted at least 30 ships docked at the station's expanded facilities, representing more species than she could immediately identify. This is remarkable, she said. But I have to ask, how are you funding all of this? Reconstruction of this scale must cost enormous amounts of resources. Chen's expression grew slightly amused. That's an interesting question. How much do you think it costs to not have a war? I'm not sure I understand. The three major powers have spent the last 6 months pouring resources into military operations. Ships, weapons, personnel, logistics, medical care for casualties, reconstruction of destroyed facilities. The economic cost has been staggering. Meanwhile, we've been spending a tiny fraction of that amount to create places where people can be safe and productive. Chen pulled up a holographic display showing economic data from across the galaxy. Look at these numbers. The Hegemony Alliance has spent more on ammunition in the last month than we've spent on this entire reconstruction project. The Stellar Federation's medical costs for treating war casualties exceed our total operating budget for all refugee assistance programs. The Void Consortium's ship replacement costs alone could fund 50 projects like this one. Zethkar studied the data with growing amazement. The sheer waste of resources involved in the ongoing conflict was mind-boggling when compared to what humanity was accomplishing with much smaller investments. You're saying that peace is actually cheaper than war? Dramatically cheaper, and more productive. The 40,000 residents of this station have produced more scientific research, cultural innovation, and economic value in the last 6 months than most military fleets produce in years. They continued their tour, visiting workshops where refugee engineers were developing new technologies, laboratories where mixed-species research teams were solving problems that had puzzled individual civilizations for centuries, and communication centers where beings were learning each other's languages and customs. This is what you were trying to achieve with the peace talks, isn't it? Zethkar asked. This kind of cooperation and mutual benefit? Something like it. But we realized that you can't negotiate this kind of society into existence. It has to be built, one relationship at a time. They entered what appeared to be a strategic planning center, where holographic displays showed the positions of human operations throughout the galaxy. Zethkar was shocked to see how extensive those operations had become. You've established 47 facilities like this one? 49 as of last week, with 12 more under construction. Each one is designed to be self-sufficient and to serve as a hub for civilian support in their region. The major powers must be aware of what you're doing. What's been their reaction? Chen's expression grew more serious. Mixed. Some military commanders see us as a nuisance. We interfere with their operational areas and complicate their strategic planning. But others have started to understand that we're providing services that make their jobs easier. How so? When you're fighting a war, the last thing you want to worry about is civilian casualties and refugee management. We take care of those problems for them. We evacuate populations from combat zones, provide medical care for non-military casualties, maintain supply lines for essential goods in neutral territories. Chen activated a new display showing communication logs between human facilities and various military commands. 3 weeks ago, a hegemony fleet commander requested our assistance in evacuating a civilian mining colony that was about to become a battleground. Last month, Federation medical officers asked us to help treat prisoners of war because our facilities had better equipment and were seen as truly neutral. The Void Consortium has been quietly allowing our supply convoys to pass through their territory because we're delivering food and medicine to systems they don't want to be responsible for. They're using your infrastructure to manage the humanitarian aspects of the war, Zethkar realized. Exactly, which means they can focus their resources on fighting each other instead of dealing with civilian problems. It's more efficient for everyone involved. The observation was deeply cynical, but Zethkar couldn't argue with its accuracy. By taking responsibility for civilian welfare, humanity was allowing the major powers to conduct their war without having to worry about the moral and practical complications that usually limited military operations. But surely this just enables them to fight more effectively? In the short term, yes. But look at what's happening in the longer term. Chen activated another display, showing casualty statistics, economic data, and territorial control maps over the past 6 months. The war is becoming less intense, not more. Without civilian populations to worry about, military engagements are more focused and precise. Without refugee crises draining resources, the major powers can afford to be more selective about their targets. Without humanitarian disasters creating political pressure, there's less urgency to escalate conflicts. The data was compelling. While the war was continuing, it was gradually becoming more limited in scope and less destructive in impact. You're managing the conflict rather than trying to end it, Zethkar said. We're reducing its harm while the participants work through their fundamental disagreements. Eventually, they'll either exhaust themselves or find reasons to stop fighting. When that happens, we'll be here to help with the transition. And if they never stop fighting, then we'll continue to provide alternatives for the people who don't want to participate in their conflict. Over time, more and more beings will choose to join peaceful communities rather than militaristic ones. They moved to a final observation area that offered a panoramic view of space around the station. Zethkar could see human ships coming and going constantly, maintaining the complex logistics network that supported dozens of facilities across the galaxy. There's something else you should know, Chen said quietly. We've been approached by representatives from several species who want to establish their own facilities using our model. Independent of the major powers? Completely independent. The Crystalline Collective is building a research station in the Outer Rim. The Nomad clans are establishing mobile facilities that can provide emergency support wherever it's needed. Even some members of the major powers are quietly setting up civilian installations that operate outside their government's military commands. The implications were staggering. Humanity's approach to the galactic conflict was inspiring other species to create their own alternatives to the traditional power structures. You're not just managing this war, Zethkar said. You're changing the entire nature of galactic civilization. We're demonstrating that there are other ways to organize society, ways that prioritize cooperation over competition, problem-solving over domination, long-term sustainability over short-term advantage. Chen turned to face Zethkar directly, which brings me to why we invited you here. The Reptilian Republic has always been known for practical diplomacy and pragmatic decision-making. You understand the value of finding solutions that work rather than solutions that look impressive on paper. What are you proposing? Partnership. Your people have resources and expertise that could be enormously helpful in expanding these civilian support networks. In return, you'd have access to the most stable and productive regions of the galaxy. Areas where your citizens could live and work without constantly preparing for the next war. Zethkar had been expecting something like this invitation, but hearing it stated directly was still striking. You're asking us to abandon our membership in the Galactic Council? We're asking you to prioritize your people's welfare over political abstractions. The Council isn't serving anyone's interests, except the major powers. Most of its members spend their time choosing sides in conflicts they don't benefit from, following diplomatic protocols that accomplish nothing, and voting on resolutions that nobody intends to enforce. The criticism was harsh but accurate. Zethkar's own experience with the council had been largely frustrating, consisting mostly of elaborate ceremonies and meaningless debates, while real problems went unsolved. What would partnership with your network actually involve? Practical cooperation on specific projects, joint research initiatives, shared resource allocation, coordinated planning for civilian protection and development. No grand alliances or political declarations, just beings working together to solve problems. Chen activated a final display showing economic and social data from human-administered facilities. Look at these outcomes: lower crime rates, higher educational achievement, more scientific innovation, better health outcomes, greater economic prosperity. These communities work because they're focused on making life better for their residents, rather than advancing abstract political goals. Zethkar studied the data carefully. The results were undeniably impressive, but they raised important questions. What about defense? What happens if one of the major powers decides your facilities are a threat? We defend ourselves, but not in the way you might expect. Our defensive strategy is based on making ourselves too valuable to attack and too dispersed to destroy. Too valuable how? We provide services that everyone needs: medical care, education, research, communication networks, supply chain management. Even military forces depend on these services. Attacking us would be like attacking the infrastructure you depend on for basic survival. And too dispersed to destroy? 49 facilities across the galaxy, with more being built constantly. Even if someone destroyed half of them, the network would continue functioning. And the cost of targeting civilian facilities would be enormous compared to any strategic benefit. It was another example of human lateral thinking. Solving the problem of military vulnerability not by building better weapons, but by making violence counterproductive. Zethkar realized that she was facing the most important decision of her diplomatic career. Supporting humanity's alternative to galactic civilization would mean abandoning the traditional power structures that had defined her entire professional life. But continuing to support those structures meant continuing to participate in a system that was clearly failing. "I'll need to discuss this with my government," she said finally. "Of course, take all the time you need. But while you're considering our proposal, I'd encourage you to spend some time here on the station. Talk to the people who live and work here. See what this alternative actually looks like in practice." Over the following weeks, Zethkar did exactly that. She interviewed refugees who had found new opportunities in human-administered facilities. She observed collaborative research projects that were producing breakthrough discoveries. She watched children from former enemy species playing together in the station's schools. Most importantly, she began to understand what humanity had really accomplished. They hadn't ended the Galactic War, but they had created something better. A demonstration that the war itself was unnecessary. By showing that cooperation was more productive than conflict, that diversity was more valuable than dominance, and that peace was more profitable than war, they had fundamentally changed the conversation about what galactic civilization could become. 3 months later, Ambassador Zethkar submitted her final report to the Reptilian Republic's Governing Council. Her recommendation was simple: withdraw from the Galactic Council and join the human-led network of civilian facilities. The vote was unanimous in favor of her proposal. Within a year, 12 more species had made similar decisions. The major powers found themselves governing smaller territories, while civilian populations increasingly chose to live in the safer, more prosperous communities that prioritized cooperation over conquest. The three-way war continued, but it became progressively less relevant to most beings' daily lives. The real future of the galaxy was being built not in council chambers or on battlefields, but in the workshops, schools, and community centers where different species were learning to solve problems together. Humanity had kept their promise. They hadn't stopped the war, but they had made it possible for anyone who wanted peace to actually achieve it. And sometimes, Zethkar reflected, that was more valuable than forcing peace on those who weren't ready for it.